Welcome to the Content 10X Podcast, the show where content creators learn how to harness the power of content repurposing. And now, your host, Amy Woods.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10X Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and this week we're talking all about how to make content repurposing a habit. So most people I know want to effectively repurpose their content. It's a no-brainer really, like why would you not want to make the most of the time that you spend creating your content? But no matter how much they want to do it, somehow it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't stick as a step within their content creation processes. Now, it does take time to get good at content repurposing, but if you tackle it one step at a time, it becomes much easier to make content repurposing a habit instead of a chore that you can often forget to do, or maybe start doing with gusto and do it every week and then it falls off. Now, we don't want that to happen. So it's all about creating habits, content repurposing habits. Now, let's just look at the definition of a habit. On dictionary.com, it says a habit is an acquired behaviour pattern regularly followed until it has become almost involuntary. Now, I don't expect the work required to repurpose content to become almost involuntary. If only it was that easy, but we do want it to become an acquired behaviour regularly followed. So you know how important consistency is when it comes to content marketing, and it's really important to be consistent with your content repurposing. Now, establishing a content repurposing habit, it's a lot like developing any new habit, like eating healthier, reading more books. It's about making small changes that last long enough that it becomes second nature. It takes time, it takes willpower to form new habits, but there are some steps that you can follow to help you get into the habit of creating content that's ready for repurposing. Now, one of the best ways to set about creating a new habit is to tag it onto an already existing habit. So something that you already do that's pretty much second nature that you don't even need to think about, and then tagging it onto that. So ask yourself, what is something that you already do every time you create content that you could tag onto that process a repurposing task? So it's about building habits on top of each other. And that's how habits can form, tagging a new habit onto an existing habit. So I'm going to really quickly go through some examples of how you can do this. So number one, video record your podcast recordings. If you're a podcaster, every time you get ready to record your podcast, when you're setting your audio up and your equipment up, consider setting it up to video record as well. Now, you may not use all of the video recording. Maybe you would even set it on a time lapse so that all you're showing people is behind the scenes of creating that week's podcast episode that you could share on social media. But consider setting up the video too, and then you can see if there's anything that you can do with that video content. So in a way, that's an additional equipment setup task and I guess scene setup task that you could add to getting ready to record your podcast. So number two, write a blog post after you've recorded your podcast or your video. So don't record your next episode, your next video, your next podcast episode until you have written that blog post, and write it straight after. So perhaps you already have the step that you write the show notes. So the show notes for your podcast host or for YouTube or your website. That's one step. Could you go a step further and write a longer form blog post as well every time? Number three, so for every video or podcast or live stream that you record, immediately after, take 5 quotes or 5 points that you made and straight away turn them into social media graphics that you can share on your social media platforms. Make that a post-production task that you hit stop, reflect on the points that you made and make those social media graphics. Number 4, another idea is after every blog post or video or podcast episode that you publish, create an Instagram story for it and make that a habit. And the reason that I think this can be done really easily is because when we talk about Instagram stories, it can be, rough and ready, not particularly polished content. So hit stop on that live stream, on that podcast, on that video, or stop typing for that blog post, and then just grab your phone and do an Instagram story and talk about that topic. Let people know what you've just done, or do it in advance and ready for it going live, but have that video ready, letting people know. And then you'll have that Insta story content for that piece of content. Number 5, another example would be to run an Instagram poll. So every time you put something out to publish, let's say it's an opinion piece where you could ask people a question based on that content, run an Instagram poll. So it goes live on that day. And as the habit you already have to check that it is live on all of the different platforms, then in addition, do your Instagram poll and get some engagement going on Instagram with polls. So number 6, if you are a podcaster, create an audiogram for every podcast episode. So this is where it is a little snippet of audio shared with an image that you can create for social media. So that's just for the podcasters listening, but every time you've finished hitting the record button, think about creating a podcast audiogram. Now for video creators, number 7, every time you finish creating that video, and perhaps you're doing your post video editing, create 1 or 2 or a few short video teasers from the longer video and make that a habit that you do that every single time, so you have that social content to share about your longer form video. Okay, number 8 is to create a separate video. So create a short, maybe up to 1 minute video of yourself just explaining what your content is about, what your podcast, your video, your blog post is about. Do that straight after you've created the content. Tag it onto that existing process. Don't let yourself create the next one until you've done this. And I do this with every single podcast episode. It's a short, less than 1 minute video because I can put it on Instagram as a post, and I create that and then we share that on our go live day on the social media platforms, and it goes on the blog post as well. So that's another idea. So number 9 is to go live. So on your platform of choice, be it Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, maybe LinkedIn if you have access, YouTube, but have a set time every week where you go live, potentially to host a Q&A, or you could bring a guest on, whatever works for you. So have a consistent published day that your core content goes live, and then have a follow-up consistent day that you do a Q&A and you speak to people, or you just do a live stream and it's in addition to that content, and make that a habit. So set that in stone and form that habit that happens after your content has gone out. And this is really similar to what I talked about in last week's episode of the podcast, where I talked about creating companion shows and companion content. So do go check that out. That's episode 118, repurposing your core content into companion content. Then number 10, this is a little bit different, turning testimonials into promotional marketing content to help build credibility and social proof. So every single time you receive a testimonial, whether that's a video or audio testimonial or written testimonial, but when you receive that, or a review, let's say you have a podcast review or a book and it's a book review on Amazon, have a process that will become a habit that you will do without even thinking, where when you receive it, you add that to your website, you create some social media graphics to share, and you schedule sharing them out. Now, maybe if you don't do all of that, maybe not at the website, but create the social media content and share out. So have a habit that you don't just receive it and then maybe file it somewhere in your emails or copy and paste it into a spreadsheet, but go that bit further and create content that you will then share for every testimonial and review that you receive. So there you go. There's just some ideas of different types of content that you create and how you can become better and more consistent at repurposing by tagging a new repurposing habit onto an existing content creation habit. So here's a few extra tips as well. So to make these habits stick, to make them become a process, suggest you could use a tool like Trello. So a project management tool like Trello or Asana or Basecamp, where you have those repeatable processes and you tag more on, but you make sure that you tick all of the boxes before you move on to the next piece of content, which builds nicely onto my next tip actually, which is consider marking the achievement of your new repurposing repurposing task with a reward. So this is basically, classic reward-based motivation. So if you are really, really, really kind of bad at always jumping to the next piece of content, the next video, the next blog post, the next podcast episode without doing any repurposing, then make it a rule that you will simply not create your next video until you have completed all of those tasks that you have set out. So all of those new habits that you're forming, it's like a reward on completion of that habit to really try and establish it and make it second nature. Now, you must be realistic as well. Make sure that the new process, the habit that you want to form, is sustainable and it isn't unreachable. So the more realistic and the more achievable it will be, obviously, the more likely that you will succeed. Perhaps commit initially to a set period of time. So say, I'm going to do this for 21 days, or I'm going to do this for the first 10 videos or podcasts or whatever of the month or something like that. Whereas you're not saying to yourself, I'm going to do this forever, but just committing to that initial time frame first and seeing how it goes. I think sometimes it's easier for people's kind of brains to process. And again, it comes to that reward, because maybe instead of rewarding yourself on a weekly basis, you could have a reward for the achievement of following and establishing this habit after a certain number of weeks or months or something like that. Another idea is to have an accountability plan and maybe even have an accountability partner as well. So if you know somebody else who's really keen at getting better with making the most of their content and repurposing their content, and maybe struggles as well to do this, then maybe what you could do is embark on this together. Both agree what your new step will be, that you'll try and establish and become a habit, and keep each other accountable, hold each other to that, meet each other, talk about it, and make sure that you keep each other on track. There you have it. There are some tips on how you can become more successful and consistent with your content repurposing by turning those tasks into habits that become second nature. I really hope that you enjoyed this week's episode of the Content 10X podcast. If you haven't got your copy yet, then please do get a copy of my book, Content 10X, More Content, Less Time, Maximum Results. You can get it on Audible as an audiobook, on Amazon as paperback and Kindle. Just head to content10x.com/book and you'll find links to all the places that you can get the book. Also, if you're interested in our fully end-to-end content repurposing service, where we help podcasters, video creators, live streamers to repurpose their regular content, then just also head to content10x.com. And of course, follow me on social media too. I'm always posting tips and advice about content repurposing. And, I even try to be funny occasionally from time to time as well. So head on over to any social media platform and you'll see the handle at Content10X. That's me. And all that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast episode. And I hope to catch you in the next one.